Welcome to our next Whiskey Sponge tasting. We're super excited to be able to keep doing these, and obviously Whisky Sponge is one of our favorite IB brands coming out of Scotland, and we're lucky enough to be joined again by Angus, who is the mastermind behind the whiskey, the bottles, the labels, and all the good things. So you've got the tasting list there. Only some of them are cask strength. I would imagine most of them are natural cask strength. But yeah, I recommend pouring them all out, having them side by side. The session will be recorded as per usual and go up on YouTube. We'll send out a link for that tomorrow, and pop any questions through the Zoom chat, or just ask to unmute yourself. It is a pretty small, intimate tasting, so I'm sure we'd love to hear your voices. But yeah, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Angus, and he can get us started on the wonderful array of whiskies we have in front of us.
Well, thanks, Emma, and thanks everyone for coming. It's always heartening to see people on the other side of the planet tuning in for our whiskies and to hear me prattle on about them. So it's much appreciated. Thank you for your support. So yeah, these guys have selected 6 drams, every single one of which I'm quite happy with, and represents in their own way kind of different angles on styles of whiskey that I really like, types of bottlings we try to do, and examples of little things that we do in our approach to independent bottling to try and invest our products with a little bit more kind of intervention or creative decision making to kind of stamp our own identity on them, which I think is really it's not, it's something I think is important for me doing independent bottling, is that I'm a creative person, and that's the thing that excites me. And all the work I do is trying to find ways to make something my own, to be creative, to do something that gives it a little bit of my own personal stamp, or as Decadent Drinks, our personal stamp. So that's an approach which is much at the forefront of my thinking in my mind when I'm developing new products and coming up with ideas for what we can do, or the sort of things we can sort of projects we can pursue long term. So anyway, we'll talk about all these things in more detail as we go along, but the first dram tonight is the Cream of Sponge, which is edition number 59A, and that's a 1993 28-year-old Highland single malt. So this is one of 2 casks we bought. We bought 2 hogsheads of this whiskey, and when I tried them, I thought, there's enough subtle difference here. Originally, I was planning just to mix them together because it's the same make. I was thinking, right, mix them together and just do it as one small batch release. But the more I tried them, I thought, okay, there's subtle differences going on here. And I thought, I had this idea in my head of something I've been wanting to do for a while anyway, and this seemed to fit the bill. I like all these old blended whiskey brands from the 50s and 40s that say, Stewart's Cream of the Barley, or Gordon MacPhail, like Pride of Strathspey, and all these things. Really quite sort of, in some ways, quite stuffy, old school, very traditionalist Scottish, sort of almost parochial branding, but often with very beautiful labels. And I thought, well, how can I sponge that? How can I take that? And so I thought Pride of Sponge, which is the sequel, and also Cream of Sponge, which sounds disgusting. But I figured also just turn it into like sponge soup and just make a silly label that riffs on these kind of historical references. So that's what the idea for it was. And yeah, so I'm a fan of this whiskey. I think I would broadly describe it as quite charismatic, distillate-driven single malt, very Highlands in style, in a kind of, it's this sort of dry, waxy, rather mineral, and quite biscuity, quite cereal, like very, very fat, almost oily cereal characteristics. One of the notes that someone said in the tasting the other night, which I couldn't get out of my head afterwards, was peanuts, like sort of peanut oil or groundnut oil or something. That kind of quite fatty, oily, old style characteristic, I think is a good way to categorize this sort of whiskey. And it's 28 years old. You do feel there's quite a bit of maturity there, but the wood is very minimal. It's not an active hogshead. So probably a sort of third or fourth fill hogshead that would have been used for a considerable time previously, then filled again in 1993. And then the maturation profile that you've had off that for 28 years is one where I would say it's much more oxidative and much more interactive internally in the cask. So I think that you're not getting as much extraction out of the cask, out of the wood, and the wood itself is probably leaving more in the whiskey. The wood itself doesn't have as much power to extract oils and fatty acids and compounds from the distillate itself. So you get a much more kind of internalized maturation process, which creates this style of whiskey, I think, which helps nurture this style of whiskey. It's quite pale. It's not overly intense on the wood. It's not overly sweet. It's quite naturally sweet, natural cereal sweetness. And again, this nice waxy, oily texture in the mouth. So slightly old style, very much my type of whiskey. And I'm very curious to hear what your impressions are, what you think of it. If any of you have if it's ringing bells over a certain distillery in your head or anything like that, then absolutely, please do tell me. Yeah. And this is bottled at natural cask strength as well. So 44 point something. I can't remember. I'm gonna get the other
44.7.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the cream of sponge we're tasting, and this is at Sibling, the pride of sponge. So yeah, both sibling casks.
I will have to say, the first time I saw the label for the cream of sponge, all I could think of was, if anyone's a fan of the Black Keys, they've got an album called Thick Freakness, and it's just someone like grabbing Vaseline out of a jar, and that's all I could think of when I saw that. It's just that very like open can kind of thing to it.
Yeah, it's quite sinister. I was deliberately wanting to go with something that was like the theme that me and my artist were talking about was like Warhol, Andy Warhol pop art kind of vibe, but also riffing off like Scottish Baxter's Tin of Soup, cheap, horrible, nasty stuff. That so it's a lot of what we do is, it could be classed as what I call radical shitness, which is trying to put delicious whiskey in a bottle and then cover it with like deliberately shit or offensive imagery. I think that's, I haven't trademarked anything, but I do think radical shitness. I'm going to try and take ownership of that because I'm quite pleased with it as a concept.
Where does T-Rex placenta come in on the back label of your tasting notes?
Well, I mean, you just got to look at all the ingredients that are bobbing around in that cream of sponge, and one can only imagine. It's a very, very old family recipe. I mean, sponges are one of the earliest life forms on planet Earth, so it's perfectly feasible that we would have stocked up on T-Rex placenta after the, whatever it was, the Permian extinction or something like that. I can't remember which one the asteroid was. We would definitely been a few spare lying about.
If you've ever had a chance of snapping up a sponge bottle, and we'll talk at the end where and if some is available still down in Australia, but the back have these amazing tasting notes. Each one's unique, funny, and sometimes it's just worth buying the bottle to read the back label. That's all I'm going to say on this topic. Emma's probably spent half an hour just can you send me pictures of the back?
So good. Yeah. It's like with wine bottles, when you like, I'm going to pick a wine because the bottle looks good, but you've managed to capture like the wine bottle satire mentality with a whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the other things I think about independent bottling is that it's a very basic thing that you're trying to do. You're trying to pick a nice whiskey that goes inside this glass container, and then if you're not into fancy packaging, which I am ideologically opposed to, because just everything. But if you're just going with this basic tall round glass bottle, like what can you really do except put something on the label which adds to the value or adds to the quality or adds to the enjoyability of this bottle? So, as long as you tick the whiskey box and you do the right thing there and you put something delicious inside, then that's a big part of the job. So then afterwards, where else can I be creative? Well, this little canvas on the front and on the back label. So I really just try to tick as many boxes as possible. And I consider doing a good job in what we do to mean the full package, like, you know, internal and external. There was, I'm going to try and get this right because it's early in the morning, well, not early in the morning for me, but the way I described it was doing whiskey bottling is like the opposite of foreplay. You have to start from the inside and work your way out. So it's like you've got to tick the whiskey internally, get that right, and then work your way out in stages and like do the front label, do the rear label. So yeah, it's just, you know, limiting yourself creatively and then being as creative as possible within that limited space that you give yourself. So I always think, you know, people say, oh, there's this tension between drinking versus collecting versus investing, whatever. But like, you know, it's so much more complicated and nuanced than that. People, understandably, if they buy a bottle of whiskey, it's expensive. They might want to just sit on the shelf and enjoy possessing it for a few years. And then if you give someone something that's cool to look at or funny, that's amusing, they can enjoy drinking the whiskey and then they can keep the bottle. The container becomes a memento of that enjoyable experience of sharing that whiskey, of its memory. It can still sit on the shelf and look fun. Or, you know, if people just want to collect it and keep it, that's fine as well, because, you know, my background was old and rare whiskies and would never have been able to enjoy or experience all of them if, you know, a bunch of crusty old Italian dudes hadn't just kept them for decades and then, you know, very considerately died and passed them on. So yeah, absolutely.
Very considerate.
What do people...
I will say, yes, please tell us your tasting notes, tell us your thoughts. And while you guys are typing that in the chat as well, I will say, when we're talking about like bottle designs and bottle shapes, if you haven't had the chance to look at the WhiskySponge satirical blog, there's a fabulous one on the Vermora bottle, which I had to stop reading halfway through because I was laughing too hard. It's anything you need to brighten your day. There's a great article in there about it, but yeah, I
got a lot of good comments for that one. So yeah, I'm glad everyone enjoyed that. I need to, I should.
It's got a real grassy note in there, yet it's super delicate. It's really, really well constructed. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Well, the cask did more work than I did in this instance, but the one thing that's interesting about this is that it's still quite a lot of whiskey in the cask, 263 bottles, but 44.7% alcohol. So it's sat in a pretty interesting part of the warehouse where it would have encouraged quite a lot of alcohol evaporation versus contents loss, which no doubt also contributes to the particular profile and character of the whiskey in this instance. The more I've done this, the more apparent it's become to me that every warehouse has a different profile of maturation, and every spot in the warehouse can also give you different aspects of, of effects. Like we're looking at a cask at the moment, which is 33 years old and 65% alcohol and only 117 bottles in the cask. So people talk about hot climate, but Scotland can kind of deliver like very slow hot climate effect plus refill wood. So you can get some really fascinating maturation results in Scotland, which perhaps people which haven't really been talked about that much, because I just think, you know, for years it wasn't something that people really noticed or commented much upon. You know, when people talk about, you know, climactic effects on maturation, everyone's minds immediately go to America, Japan, the rum producing nations in much hot, tropical climate parts of the world. I don't know what it's like out in Australia. I mean, what sort of climate do you guys get in the likes of Taz or Oz? I mean, you must get some pretty hot climate effects out there, I would have thought.
A lot of our distillers and even some of our IBs, like Tim Duckett, who's world famous with his Heartwood independent bottler, he has coined the term whiskey matures in seasons in Australia. So number of summers, not number of years anymore. And ABV can go up in some parts of the country and go down. Water goes up and down. It's all over the place. And the distilleries can be 20 Ks from each other and still it's random.
Yeah. Absolutely. And with the 4 seasons in one day, it's very, very much random. Yeah.
No, that's really fascinating. That's cool.
I'm getting that grass note on the whiskey, but now I've finished the whiskey and I'm nosing the glass and it's creamy, and I didn't get the creaminess before. Like that's
Well, the cream of sponge. You found it.
Well, yeah, I love the notes we got so far, Gary. It's absolutely a breakfast dram. It's as Lockie from Whiskey and Ailment might say, it's a bedside table dram. You know, it's just there. You pour yourself a glass in the morning. But yeah,
These are
Paul's
very
very honest. Whiskey.
daytime sippers. Yeah, absolutely. So shall we
Move on to the next.
mosey over to the next one? Yeah. So next along
Ben
is
Nevis.
the Ben Nevis. Yeah.
Oh, looking forward to that.
So this one is going to be interesting. So this is probably the most pure distillate-driven example of all the 1996 Ben Nevises that I've come across, which, because I'm kind of ideologically in love with this whole idea of very, very pure distillate-driven distillery character whiskies. I was obviously gonna I'm predisposed to love it. So this was refill butt, very big refill butt, a lot of whiskey in it, and this was one we bought. It was like maybe a year and a half ago or something. We bought this cask and was trying it and thinking we could have some fun with this cask. So the idea we've done is we bottled just under half this cask now, and we bottled it with slight reduction, well, reasonable amount of reduction actually, to 53%. So this cask strength was sitting up close to 60%. So the plan is now to leave it for another year and a bit, sitting in the rest of the whiskey sitting in cask with a much higher volume of headspace, and just see what happens to it. And we'll bottle the rest of it next year, and I'll probably do the rest of it just at cask strength. So that'll be edition 58B. So the one we're trying today is 58A, and the concept I've come up with is basically just young Sponge interviewing old Sponge about his life and experiences and regrets and all this stuff. So I haven't even written the answers yet, because my mind might change in between now and bottling the second half of the cask, so we'll see. But yeah, so I like this one because you can get the fruit of the Ben Nevis 96. I mean, I suspect a lot of you have tried some other Ben Nevis from these years. It's really shit hot stuff in whiskey now. Everyone wants these Ben Nevis casks. They're trendy, they're understandable, they're beautiful whiskies. Colin Ross, the manager at that point, was making stunning distillate, really one of the last guys that truly understood, I think, the real differences between old style production and contemporary production, and tried to maintain a lot of the qualitative aspects of older style production, and had the freedom at the time to do so. The Japanese owners were not, sort of not pushing too hard on him one way or the other to make whiskey a certain way. So he had a fair bit of freedom to do this. And, Ben Nevis was always a pretty sort of hands-on, grubby, industrial, traditional distillery. And so the style of whiskey he was making in the late 90s was, I think, really beautiful, and shows beautifully now these parcels of 1996 hoggies and butts that have come to the market. This really quite specific tropical fruit character, like slightly overripe mashed banana, mashed pineapple, this kind of overripe exotic fruit flavor, alongside some medicines and some waxes and some little herbal tones. Beautiful flavor profiles, which I really love, and I find a lot in much older whiskies. So I felt this example was something that, it doesn't taste like it's 25 years old, for one thing. I think it tastes considerably younger. And I loved the really sharp, zingy fruitiness that was coming out of it, and a very pure kind of mineral profile. So there was lots about it which really spoke to me, and I thought, this is going to be fun. We can have a little bit of an experience, a bit of a journey with this cask, and just do half now, half later, see how it behaves. So yeah, it's probably a whiskey which is not necessarily everyone's cup of tea, although everyone we've poured it for so far seems to like it. But I was expecting, when we bottled it, I was a bit nervous, because I thought this is quite an ideological whiskey, and I imagine it might be divisive, but I think it's great. So anyway, I'm curious to hear what you lot think, and if you've tried other Ben Nevis, how this compares to other 1996s you might have tried recently. I think this is the least cask influenced one I've come across so far.
I was just looking behind me. So I've been lucky enough on my visits to Melbourne, a few different importers of different IBs, but all the 96 Nevises are sherry influenced or something. They're super dark. And you know, I just had to just refresh my memory. Even the one we did with the Highlander in was a 97 and it's pitch black in comparison. Why it's awesome that you got such a light, you know, spirit forward spirit.
There's lots out there which are, I mean, we did one just recently before, which was just a refill hogshead, but that was considerably darker. And what's nice about this parcel, it's quite a big parcel of casks, and lots of them have gone to the indie market, private individuals, and there's a big diversity amongst it of cask types. There's lots of, it's mostly hogsheads, but there's lots of varying levels of activity, and you can tell there was not maybe the most thought put into what was filled, but that after leaving the stock to sit for 20 plus years, and some of them no doubt will hit 30, is that, you know, these whiskies have all gone down slightly different tangents and shown this spirit in various different lights. And I think that's really nice, because you can tell that the quality of the distillate shines through under so many different profiles, whether it's quite intense sherry or whether it's really like this, totally naked. I think that's a sign of a great whiskey, that can be diverse at different ages, different cask types and different strengths. So it's making me actually want to go, and shouldn't really have a dram at this time of day. But,
go on, if you're going to pick one tonight.
No judgment here.
Today.
I mean, I wouldn't. I'm not going to pick one, because if I do this, I'll just taste them all.
One more follow-up question, because I know we regularly get asked, and I'm always curious, did something happen in 96 that it's a particular well-known vintage for Nevis, like 93 is for Dronic, or is it just the latest year, because 92 is quite popular too?
I think what happened is just that it's probably that they were told, make some money, or Colin had a gap that year where he could sell a higher number of casks than he was usually allowed to. So Ben Nevis is a really curious distillery, in that the Japanese say, they own it and say, oh, we need X amount for our blend, and they'll choose, you know, sometimes they'll come along, empty the warehouse of one particular parcel of stock, whatever. But often that means that there's odd parcels left around for Colin to decide, this is what we're going to bottle as 10-year-old, this is what we're going to do this as a single cask, or I'm going to sell fillings of all this stuff. I think it's just that there was some of these big parcels of 96 sat there, and, you know, in the years, and really like 2 decades plus since 1996, when no one gave a shit about Ben Nevis. I mean, when I got into whiskey early 2000s, Ben Nevis was seen as a bit of a joke. Like it was affectionately thought of, but only in the sense of, oh, Ben Nevis is never boring, but yeah, some of them taste like cheese. So, but now it's revered, and it's almost like a blue chip name, really, and rightly so, because it's quite it's a charismatic, romantic West Coast single malt West Highland whiskey, and there's not many like that. So yeah, I think that it's just a combination of Colin had freedom to sell a lot more of that stock, and it's just kind of surfed a wave of like rising fascination in that distillery, in that particular profile of, you know, quite Highland old style single malt. And also at the same time, that parcel of stock has kind of come online in terms of its maturity, and it's showing at its absolute best. So it's just a kind of perfect storm of circumstances that come together to really elevate these whiskies very highly in the kind of collective whiskey consciousness. And, you know, this is the sort of profile that I think more and more people are getting switched onto. The more conversations that we have in the whiskey culture around the world through the, you know, the madness of the internet, and the more whiskey culture expands, the more people tend to alight on these types of whiskies as things that they really appreciate and desire and recognize value in and recognize beauty in. And that is, you know, in turn what's driving this sort of supply and demand dynamics, which make prices very difficult. And, you know, it's understandable really when you look at that. These are the sort of whiskies that everyone wants to drink and possess.
Yeah, it's that hard moment where you're like, I love Ben Nevis, but it's slowly getting out of my reach. And, I'm glad I bought what I could early on
Yeah.
and loving it. But this is
Yeah.
incredible. I mean, this tastes so very different to a lot of the 1996 Nevises that I've had. And there've only been a few that have been in hoggies and stuff like that. But like, if a whiskey could taste like Narnia, this tastes like Narnia. It's that like teak oak furniture and resin pine needles and like winter berries. Yeah, it's incredible.
The other thing I'd say is that this this has been open for a while, my sample bottle, and it's actually showing even more powerfully now. Like if you get one and you open it, I'd recommend taking a long time to drink the bottle, because it's one of those whiskies that certainly benefits from a bit of air. So like drink down to here in night one, leave it for 6 months and then come back to it, and you probably have a different dram, or one of those whiskies have a dram every month or something like that, and see how it evolves with air and time in the bottle, because it absolutely does open up really well. And that finish on it is really lovely. And as well, the cask strength version was, when I sampled this cask, really like pronounced, sharp, zingy pineapple and very trebly, almost like estery fruit notes. But bringing it down to 53% is what's balanced that with like that minerality that people have mentioned a bit in the tasting note. That is really much more pronounced with dilution. So that's another example of where I think targeted bottling strength really helps play a part in presenting a whiskey in its best light. But I think for sake of comparison, when we do the rest of this cask, we'll do it at cask strength for sure.
I just want to say I'm going to echo Emma's comments. This might be our favorite Japanese whiskey of the year so far.
Yeah. This is genuine Japanese whiskey. Yeah. And if you check the label for our previous
Japanese
previous Ben Nevis, where we had Spongezilla and Mount Fuji at the top of Ben Nevis. So yeah, we've had a few jokes with that. If I could get away with labeling a Ben Nevis as Japanese whiskey, I 100% would do it. In fact, I'm not sure if there's there's no regulations around Japanese whiskey, so maybe I could do it.
There are now, as of April last year.
I know, but
I suppose over there aren't.
I'll just backdate it. It's fine.
As long as you don't sell it in Japan, yeah.
But aren't those regulations for whiskey made in Japan though, to make it more transparent? So if you bottle it in Scotch but call it a Japanese, there's no regulations in Scotland or Australia.
To be honest with you, if I did it, it would open in a massive hornet's nest, and I'm pretty sure our bottler would just refuse to allow the label anyway. So it's probably a moot point, really, unfortunately, until we get our own bottling line, just like probably 2 years away.
I mean, you could just say definitely not a Japanese whiskey. That way you're legally covered. You're fine.
Yeah, or we'll just keep doing like... Carry on, Emma. Sorry,
I was gonna say we could pop on from one fabulous and slightly out of reach distillery to another with the Springbank. But you finish your question.
Yeah,
yours first.
Yeah, so the Springbank is a cask, a pair of casks that we bought from a private client. So there's still some people out there that have got these casks of Springbank owned privately that they bought for, frankly, buttons in the 1990s. So this was 1994, and it was a refill sherry hogshead, and pretty reasonably old cask, I imagine, because I don't get a huge amount of sherry character out of it. But what I do get is a really lovely, mature 90s Springbank profile. 1993 up until about 93, some Springbanks could be a little bit funky and odd. They had a sort of a weird patch of production, but things seem to really improve from 94 onwards. So this guy had a 94 and two 95s, and we got a 94 and a 95. The other 95 was soapy, so we rejected it, which is insane when you think about it, like reject a cask of 95 Springbank. But I tell this story because it's like, oh, we're not just going to bottle Springbank just because we can sell it. We are actually going to be reasonably sort of ruthless and discerning and say no when we have to. So yeah, the Springbank, 1994, single refill hogshead, bottle at natural cask strength, which is like 47%. So, yeah, 47%. Yeah. And again, this is just a really, I think just a lovely, elegant, very vivid, natural take on Springbank distillery character, which, you know, for the, I'm sure many of you have tried these lovely Springbanks before, you really focusing on this sort of lovely coastal power at the heart of it, but draped over that is all this really lovely, intricate waxiness, little thready bits of peat smoke from that lightly peated Springbank barley. And also I tend to find quite a lot of like sort of oily citrus fruits as well, and a few little like green and tropical fruit touches, and that's all really well integrated, so you get just a kind of cohesive whole flavor after all that time. So it's 27 years in cask, and you end up with just like a flavor which is just old Springbank flavor, and perfect strength, 47%, just so easy, and you know, on the palate straight away. It's such a shame that these things are now very expensive, because it means that if you open one, you know, it can be a bit painful, but and the drive with this sort of whiskey, I think, is not necessarily to drink it in little centiliter drops and to savor it for ages and ages. It's a whiskey which works best when you pour like an inch into a tumbler and take a big mouthful and just let it sort of, you know, drain down into you and take all that lovely Springbank deliciousness with it. So yeah, there's sort of a melancholy about doing Springbank now, but also it's cool to be able to bottle these whiskies, and it's exciting to be able to find these casks, and we're always looking for them. But yeah, not much else to say about it really. It's just delicious old Springbank, and you know, it's always a thrill to bottle it. So we went for very minimalist labels with this one, where I just thought I'm going to do a sort of tribute to like early 20th century typewriter written labels, which you do see particularly for old bottles of malt whiskey, like private bottlings of malt whiskey. There's loads of examples historically where the people have just done very basic labels with a typewriter, which I always think is so charming and really cool. So that was really what we were kind of referencing with these ones. So how do people like the Springbank? Because I mean, I imagine you're probably going to like this. It's pretty no-brainer whiskey, really.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds really bizarre to me, and I, coming from a Greek background, it tastes like, you know, those vintage perfumes that the old ladies would just bathe themselves in, and you walk in to hug them and it's like you're assaulted with all of this aroma. It's what I'm getting, but I'm obsessed with it. It's that like vintage perfume, that lemon citrus that, you know, they've been, you know, it's
this is vintage perfume that's different from 80s Bamor.
Yes.
This is as distinct to the French Ladies of the Night perfume, which was, yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah, this sort of very aromatic, scented sort of profile, and you know, citrus done. Yeah, I know what you mean. Although my experience with perfume-drenched old ladies is, I don't know. Look,
it's never
in Scotland. It's probably quite a different aroma. I used to spend a lot more time with little old ladies when I worked in auctions. I would drive around up north, often visiting little old ladies who had cupboards full of their dead husband's whiskey, which and I would have to eat a lot of chocolate biscuits and drink a lot of very milky tea, and eventually they would part ways with them. So yeah, it was memories of that. Happy memories.
Their inheritance.
Well, not even that. Well, yes, sort of. But you know, all these sort of old Scottish guys that would work at distilleries, they would retire and then sort of very predictably die within like 2 years. And then these little ladies that would go on for, you know, 2 or 3 more decades after that, just, you know, ferrying about the town, buying, shopping and baking furiously and knitting and things like that. And then they would just have this whiskey accumulate in these cupboards, and oftentimes they weren't aware of how valuable it was. But it was always fascinating to go and hear their stories, and most of the times when you come around, they'd already decided they were going to sell the whiskey, didn't care about that, but they were going to put you through your paces and interrogate you on the sofa with, like, you had to eat a lot of slightly out of date chocolate biscuits. So it was, yeah, I was like when I was at my fattest, just driving around eating chocolate biscuits all day.
And then you get the classic, so is there a lady in your life? I have a lovely daughter, you know.
Do you know what? There's not that many of them offered up daughters. I mean,
Lucky.
yeah, sadly, I don't know.
Maybe it's an
Yeah,
Aussie thing, Emma.
No, I mean, like, obviously, you know, my mom's background being Greek, thankfully we didn't get too much of that, but there's always the undertone of when you're going to settle down with a good Greek boy, and it's like, oh God, no. There's always, it's the little old ladies, it's all they want is they want grandchildren.
That's very true. Yes, I got questions, so maybe it was being prepped. Who knows? Groomed for, yeah. Oh, gosh.
We've done a few other IB Springbanks earlier this year. A mid-Dira finish, one of the IAAS's pitch black bottling. The Springbank distillate disappeared in the cask. It was all wood. Yeah. I personally wasn't a fan, and they were very expensive bottles to acquire, and we cracked it as a tasting because when you get a bottle, you know, that much, it's fun to try it and go for it. But this, the spirit, you know, it is what it is. It can't hide, and some people think are buying into the hype now because it's a well-known distillery and they've never even had a Springbank before, and then it may catch people off guard. It's kind of one of those ones you have to, I think, enjoy. But I was going to say, even the Springbank 10, a retailer, I won't say who, has got it for £250 now. Yeah, it's gone nuts.
It's going silly, and you do wonder what the sustainability of this is. I think it cuts both ways, because I think Springbank should really have put their prices up and kind of reposition themselves a little bit some time ago. Like Springbank 10, at the price they were selling it for a long time, given what it is and how much of it they make and the quality, I think it was underpriced. It didn't need to be massively expensive, but, you know, a bottle like that nowadays probably should be about £80 retail. I don't know, but their focus, which is very noble, is this idea of, you know, we care about the town, we care about our employees. But even if you are already making enough money, like you know, protecting your brand protects that situation. And, you know, if you make more money, you can reinvest in your distillery, and, you know, you can pay your workers more, you can, you know, do all sorts of things. And I think Springbank's been set upon and cannibalized a little bit by people who are just purely aggressively flipping, but also, you know, it's a perfect fusion. It's one of these things where so many of these forces have just sort of aligned simultaneously, because it's not just crazy flippers, it's also people that have got deep pockets and love the whiskey. And it's, you know, it's all these things all at once going into a very fast moving, new emerged kind of architecture where you've got this very active, very powerful secondary market. So yeah, it's just, Springbank has become kind of taken over by these new forces in a way which the distillery itself haven't quite been very active in. I mean, they have in some ways. I mean, they would say they have by doing things like their single casks in 20 cl bottles, so everyone can get, you know, more people get to buy one and taste them. But even then, they just get sold anyway. So, you know, there's only so much you can really do, I think. And it's sad in some ways, but it also means that every time we get to try, you know, a nice bottle like this, like you guys, you know, go to the effort of opening one for a tasting like this, it's a nice occasion, and it makes us all remember that, you know, these whiskies are special, and they're special and valuable and interesting for a reason, which is because they're very singular, of a place, and distinctive and delicious, and you can't replicate Springbank anywhere else in the world except in Campbelltown. So yeah. So there's another one of these, there's the 60B, which is a 1995. That's just a plain refill hogshead, and that's slightly higher in strength. And I would say the difference between them is that one is really more kind of a bit drier, more mineral, more like powerfully waxy. It's a bit more of a powerful example. And this one is perhaps more finesse, more elegance, and more fruit, I would say, overall. So we did, of the people that have tried both, my experience is that is quite an even split in terms of who prefers which one. So yeah, and my own preference is whichever one I'm drinking at the time usually. So it tends to vary. Cool. So does anyone else have any questions or anything else about the Springbank before we move along?
Paul, you're nodding. Is it thumbs up for you? I know you like your Springers.
Good. All right, thumbs up, thumbs up. I'm always pleased with a thumbs up. Yeah, so then moving along, the next dram in the lineup is the Islay 1990. So this is, in my view, unquestionably a Laphroaig. It can't really be Ardbeg. It can only really be two whiskies because this is ex-Allied Distillers stock, blending stock, essentially. So the reason it's unnamed is because on the sheets that where all the data of casks is kept and when parcels of stock are traded or swapped or sold, whatever, these are just listed as Islay single malt, and the wood and the original fillings and everything, it's all ex-Allied Distillers, and Allied Distillers had Ardbeg and Laphroaig in the early 90s. And the flavor of these is just not Ardbeg. I know Ardbeg, I would say, pretty intimately from those vintages. I worked at the distillery in early 2005, 2006, and there were lots of these early 90s casks around, tried many examples of them. This is not that distillate. It's much closer in my mind and palate to Laphroaig. So I think that's what it must be. And what has happened with these stocks is that, because you see quite a few bottlers have, 89, 90, 91, some 92s. I'm convinced this is all from their same few big parcels. And the reason they were just labeled Islay single malt is because these were always intended for blending. But just what's happened, the market has moved along and these have become more valuable to their owners to sell as single malt parcels to indie bottlers and to brokers, which is how we've ended up with them. And I think these beautiful whiskey. So I love Laphroaig from these vintages. I think it just shows that lovely balance of fruit and sort of reasonably chunky peat, some lovely medicinal aspects, and also this really pronounced and quite long-lived coastal profile, which still seems so fresh even after 31 years in wood. What else is interesting about these stocks is that they've been vatted in the past. I don't know how many years ago, but they would have been single casks vatted to make consistency amongst the batch and then put back into those casks and probably consolidated upwards so the casks are quite full, which creates a different kind of profile again. It creates a certain amount of homogeneity between the overall batch, but after a few more years, each cask starts to single off again and take on its own profile, which is why we've kind of tried to hold off for as long as possible with some of these parcels to bottle them when they're a bit older and when they've started to take on a little bit more individuality between them. So we've got a few more of these coming, but this was the first of the 1990s that we did. And the reason I chose this label is that, so my father, his favorite whiskey was Laphroaig, and he sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but he was very instrumental in my getting into whiskey. And he was not a whiskey fan really in the sense of modern whiskey nerdery, but he liked a single malt. He was a sort of West Coaster, sort of working class West Coast Scottish guy at heart, and liked single malt in a very simple, direct, and no nonsense, honest way. He just liked Laphroaig 10, liked Kalila, liked the flavor of peat, and took a lot of pleasure from just having a dram and a tumbler. And I learned a lot from that, and that was very instrumental and influential on me at a young age. So this was a little tribute bottling I did to Dad, and I couldn't call it Laphroaig, but trying to find named Laphroaig now is next to impossible and excruciatingly expensive if you want to do one, to the point that it makes no commercial sense to do it almost. So this was a sort of happy compromise for me, and that's why I decided to do it, a bit more of a serious, sort of slightly artistic, elegant label. And the whiskey inside was very fitting because I think a few of you are commenting now, it's beautiful. I think it's a really elegant, nicely complex, beautifully balanced example of aged Laphroaig distillate, where you're getting these things I touched upon, like fruit, peat, medicine, coastal, sort of sharp, zingy, salty notes, but all integrated, all balanced. And it goes back to what I was saying about the Springbank. It's a sense of a cohesive single flavor profile, which just says mature old Laphroaig from these kind of vintages. So yeah, I'm pleased to see lots of comments about it, saying you like it. I think it's lovely whiskey.
Angus,
yeah,
any chance, how come you didn't call it like a Williamson?
It's not labeled as Williamson. Williamson is a much more modern thing. That's stocks from recent years, which it is Laphroaig, just under a different filling name for reasons of, you know, swapping on or selling onto brokers markets. It's a way that, so every distillery now, slowly but surely, is coming up with an alternative filling name, which is a way to protect a brand name while still being able to capitalize on selling into the brokers market. And it's fine for people that want blends, because the blenders don't need the names, they just want the make for their recipes. It's the independent bottlers that get screwed over, because we obviously want the names, but it just forces creativity. It's why I've come up with this code name Candle Kitty for Laphroaig, for Clynelish. So any unnamed Clynelish, I'll just call it Candle Kitty, and everyone knows exactly what it is. We haven't had to do, we've been lucky. Most of the stuff we've been able to bottle is either named, or if it isn't named, there's a fair enough reason, or it's a blended mull, and it doesn't really matter so much. If we came upon some really nice whiskey, like there's some really lovely unnamed Glenlivet on the market from the 90s. If I happened upon a cask of that, I would just come up with a different code name that was very obvious, and we'd just do that, just have fun. The SMWS were unconsciously ahead of themselves when they came up with this coding numbering system, because it's a very simple way to circumnavigate that issue of names and brands.
I just purchased a bottle of a bottle called Red Bag, which is an anagram for another Islay distillery.
Yeah, so that was another thing. So people like the Nectar with their Daily Dram series for a long time were doing anagrams. So anagrams, numbers, code names, or just silly labels which make it very obvious. So we've got an unnameable Glen Grant coming up in a few months' time. 2003 Glen Grant from really interesting batch of stock, lightly peated, really lovely whiskey, but we're not allowed to name it. So my plan is just to do the classic Glen Grant label to Highlanders, but they're just going to be redacted with like gags and eye patches. And then we've got tasting notes on the back from the famous and world-renowned Speyside whiskey collector Len Grant. So it's just an excuse to, it turns it into an excuse to have fun.
Do you mind if I chuck the label up so people to see this one?
Yeah, fire on. Yeah, absolutely.
I'll just chuck it up on the Zoom there. I love this label. Obviously, it's a tribute to your dad, but also your newborn as well. So I think it's a beautiful one.
I was sort of not sure really, because I'm reticent to put personal things out there unless it's done in a kind of quite tasteful, careful way, which I think this manages. But I don't. Yeah, I'm not a fan of oversharing, shall we say? So, but yeah, I'm happy with it, and I had lots of nice feedback. And most important to me was that the whiskey was really good. So that was, it ticked that box. And yeah, so some good comments. So that David saying that punchiness belies 31 years of age, lots of green fruits. Yeah, so I completely agree with that kind of assessment. I think it is one of those situations where it's 31 years old, but probably tastes more like a kind of 20 to 25-year-old with the amount of freshness and power that's retained in there. And the strength is perfect, 51%, that kind of age. It just keeps everything in check and holds everything together. Any 73 Speyside hiding in your warehouse? No, we don't even have a warehouse yet. It's a nightmare. And if I could get some 73 Speysides, would almost certainly be a question of immediately bottling them. So sadly not, but if we find any, you'll be the first to hear about it.
Angus, you mentioned redacted. I won't go on too long, but there's a Tasmanian distillery that's notorious in Australia for its barrel investment scheme that went under.
Right.
Another distiller bought a bunch of those barrels and is selling the whiskey now under his own IB, but you can see the back of the label, everything's redacted. And then the front, he's got a bunch of Tassie, devils and other characters. Basically, selling the good story of what it should have been, not the back. But yeah, legally, he's just told the whole story, then redacted the name. So it's been a lot of good fun, and people like that whiskey here. But that's what you just remind me of.
Yeah. I like, it's something we haven't played around with yet, is messing about with redacting and just, so I think that the Glen Grant that's coming will definitely lean rather heavily on those sorts of ideas. I think everyone seems to enjoy the Laphroaig. We've got more coming. We've got we've got another 1990 coming in September. In fact, can I show you the label for that? Yeah, it's not quite finished. You'll see it soon enough. So we're going to do a series, like a sub-series, and we've done Orkney Sponge. We're going to do Islay Sponge as well. And so there's going to be a little mini series called Islay Sponge coming. And then I've got another 91 coming in January, and we're going to do that next to a 1991 Jura. So we're going to compare them side by side. And the plan for that is to come up with like a fight label. So like Islay versus Jura, and it's just going to be like a pitched sea battle or something like that. I'm still sort of ruminating in my head how we're exactly going to do it, but it's going to be another one where it's edition numbers sort of side by side, so it forms a kind of single fun thing. So
the caramel Kraken is going to return.
Caramel Kraken may reappear. We'll see. It's going to be quite a complicated. I think I'm going to spend a lot of money on the artwork for those ones because it's quite complicated what I've got in my head. But they're both beautiful whiskies and quite striking, the difference, but also some similarities. So it's pretty cool. So any super fruity ones? What's this? Oh, with the Islas, they're all kind of similar levels of fruit to the one you're trying just now, I would say. Like mostly green fruits with a little bit of citrus and tropical character in there as well. It's difficult to say because one thing I've discovered is that, so even if you bottle a whiskey at cask strength, like this frequently happens with stock that we buy from Signatory, which these all are casks we're buying from Signatory. Like you dump a cask, no dilution or anything, just goes straight into the tank and then goes through the bottling line into these toll rounds, cask strength, minimal filtration, just goes through a barrier filter to take out excess particulate matter. And yet it can still come across when you finally get a bottle and open it as different in profile from how you remember the cask sample. And it's not just that a few months have elapsed since the cask sample was drawn. Or, I don't know what it is, but sometimes the profile just changes a bit. Very rarely for the worse, usually for the better. So I think these Islas will have a probably more varying amount of fruit profile than I think they will, but I couldn't tell you more about what that's going to be. There's an element of mystery about how they're actually going to show up in the bottle. I have samples of them all on my desk and they're all outstanding. So you will just have to buy all of them.
And Angus, have you ever gotten a situation where the sample you've tried, the actual cask that it ends up getting to is way worse in quality? You just said that rarely happens. But if it does happen, what are you left to do? Do you have to re-rack it into a PX cask?
If it was really terrible, then there would have to be recriminations with the bottler and you'd have to really try and understand what went wrong. It's never happened so far. It's been, the worst instances are just that, it hasn't quite turned out exactly as I'd hoped. It's still good, but so there was one instance which I found very frustrating at the time, and I learned a lot through doing it, was when we did our very first Equinox and Solstice bottling. It was technically a 10-year-old Edradour. But what it was a first fill barrel of 2010 and a first fill barrel of 2003, both mixed together. And I did a pre-mix at home where I was kind of trying to guess ratios and create my own little blend at home to sort of understand if I wanted to do this bottling this way, because it was a challenge at the time to say, pay £110 for this technically 10-year-old Edradour, even though half of it, or just under half of it, is like 17 years old. So it was expensive, and it was, and yeah, but there were too many variables that I wasn't able to accurately determine. So first of all, the 10-year-old and the 2003 component, the ratio probably wasn't quite right that I'd mixed, and I reduced it to 48.5%, but I was maybe not using the right water, or just the time it then sat in cask and then was dumped together and then was reduced, the way that was all done and then put into bottle. There were so many potential variables happening that the final character of the whiskey was not necessarily what I was expecting or wanting. Now, fast forward, and the bottle I've got still open is really lovely, and it's gone in a totally different direction. And actually, every time I go back to it, I'm happier and happier with the whiskey. But it's one it's gone completely under the radar since, and no one really talks about it, and I don't know anyone that's really tried it. I would probably put it into a tasting at some point as a kind of archive thing and talk about it a bit more, because it's really a bottling that I learned a lot through doing, and I've been much more disciplined and careful about trying to control home blending and checking it, because we do a lot of this stuff, and I was like determined not to stop trying to do these things just because I had one example which went a bit left field. I still like doing these multi-vintage blends, and like the Glenkeith, the Jura we've done recently, where we take two casks the same whiskey from different years, different cask types, and squish them together to create something unique. Because I really am a big believer that we should be putting out whiskies which other people can't put out.
Sure.
Like, if in this day and age, if you want to get ahead and you want to offer you guys consumers something specific that is unique to us, you can't get anywhere else, then making small batch blends is one way to do it, and utilizing stocks which other people, even if they have access to, they're not doing the same thing. They're doing single casks. So I'm using every little weapon in my arsenal at the moment to try and create things specific to us. And once we have our own warehouse in, I don't know, a year's time maybe, these things will become much more possible, and you'll see more interesting products, I hope. But yeah, there's always things that happen which can surprise you. And I suppose the difference now between like a year and a half ago is that I've really got my antennas raised for any alarm bells, and I'm very, very meticulous about, if we do any mixing of casks, I make sure I've got the exact dips, the exact levels, the exact strengths, and I use the correct water, and I'm really meticulous about ratios and yeah. And then at the end of the day, you've got to decide, I'm pretty confident these are going to be good, let's just go for it. And on the last two times we did it at Glenkeith and Jura, I've been very pleasantly surprised that they've turned out even better than I hoped. So that was good.
Yeah, awesome. Well, we might move on to the different Glen, the Glenlivet.
Yes, so this was a cask of 2007 Glenlivet, a first fill sherry hogshead. And you've probably seen quite a lot of this. This is a big parcel of stock. Lots of people have them. You've probably seen a few of them bottled by other bottlers as well as by Signatory. And the cask strength in these is always up around 65 to 66% alcohol. Really like eye-wateringly punchy high strengths. And I think they're very, very good whiskies. Great parcel of stock, very modern. So this to me is like modern sherry, but in a good way, in that you get really nice juicy darkness, lots of kind of like cedar, leather, tobacco vibes, very earthy, very chocolatey, but quite punchy. And the high alcohol magnifies that punchiness, and I think carries through quite a lot of tannin, because that high alcohol is like really dissolved out quite a bit of tannin from the oak. So I thought, let's just take it right down, dial it right down to 53%. And I think that works really well, because it made a much more approachable dram. I think it makes it a much more immediate and easy. And I think something that's really important in whiskey is pleasure and enjoyment. And I think there's a place for sitting down with your pals and pouring a 2CL dram and nosing and dissecting and, going all in for these like mega cask strength bombs. But there's also a place which is kind of more what we aim to tailor for, which is whiskies that you can just pull the cork, pour into a tumbler or a Glencairn or whatever tasting glass you want, and just immediately have pleasure, and just immediately have something which doesn't force you to overthink, doesn't kind of dominate you intellectually, but just something you can. This is a whiskey really is designed for large dram, feet up, favorite album on, and just shut the door, you know, put a little sign up saying "fuck off world," and, you know, have some zen time. That's really what I think whiskey is for anyway. And I suppose it's also a dram that is designed that if you want to pour it blind for your pals and have a more of like a nerd out sort of session with it, and, you know, play guessing games, it can do that as well. But I think in order to do both things, the reduction was pretty essential. So yeah, it's just a whiskey that reflects my tastes, but you know, and it's what I consider to be a very good example of a sort of modern style sherried whiskey. And I think you get more fruit as a result of bringing the strength down. The kind of dark fruit, you know, that, like, you know, juicy, dark, sticky fruit, dates, figs, prune, that kind of characteristic, which is always a benchmark of good sherry to me. That's much more visible and much more immediately apparent in the whiskey because of the reduction. It wasn't there at natural cask strength, and this was 66.2% this cask. So yeah, and I may have chosen to do something different if everyone else was doing these casks with reduction, but everyone else does them at cask strength. And I, having tried many of them, I find them good, but too much. So yeah, I just thought, let's go the opposite direction and do 53.
Do you have a bottle near you? Because the front's an exciting label, but the back is, you just mentioned nerd out over whiskey. You can't get nerdier than the back of this label, I think.
Yeah, so the front label is just, it's like the guy on the label is my business partner, Stephen, who, so we have like we have these very silly labels and very, like, you know, we don't take life seriously, and that's our presentational aspect of our company. But behind the scenes, we have some very experienced people who have a lot of experience in business, way more than I do. I am just the annoying creative person that gets in the way. These guys are like spreadsheet wizards and understand things like unit economics, and they basically crave data. They're kind of like the sort of the Borg for data, and they frequently say to me, "We need more data, Angus, more data, more things, more information, blah, blah, blah." And so this was a label basically just having a bit of an in-joke and taking the piss out of their unquenchable lust for data. And then the rear label is essentially trying to do a tasting note as a spreadsheet, and with one error there where we don't understand how palate reduced doesn't add up to 100% of, yeah, you'll have to get a hold of this and look at it to understand. But
can you hold up the front and the back for us?
So this is the rear label here, which is just like a it's like flavors and palate as, yeah, so flavors, neat, reduced, palate, nose, blah blah blah, and quantified as data. That's about the level of my spreadsheet abilities. And then the front is my colleague Stephen as a kind of godhead from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. That was the kind of mood I was going for with this label. So, and then there's like this tiny little like emaciated sponge up in this corner here, just like mining the data mines for bits and numbers and shit. So yeah, that was the theme. Nothing to do with the whiskey, except perhaps that if you were to pair this whiskey with a film, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom would probably be quite a good match. All those sort of reds and underground moods and vibes suit a sherried whiskey, I think. So yeah, that's the Glenlivet. What's people's thoughts on it? Enjoy it? Great juicy flavors after having the Laphroaig. Yeah, that's I think that's true. I think it's quite interesting to, normally, you know, the logic is you put the Laphroaig at the end of a tasting, but I think going through 4 sort of very refill in some instances, profile drams, all very distillate forward, and then having like a handbrake turn into strong heavy sherry, that's quite a nice way to let the Glenlivet show in a very, very extreme light by comparison. So yeah.
Came off cool. Better than I intended. It really comes through with those like really when you get those red grapes, but they've been harvested late and they're just full of sugar. It's
yeah, that sort of botrytic gooey sweetness. Yeah, I know what you mean. I like that as well. Yeah, no, well, it was a good idea of yours to do that, so that's worked out nicely. So yeah, final dram is the Equilibrium. So just grab my bottle off the shelf. So this is Equilibrium second edition.
Is this one you poured me at the whiskey show?
Yes,
Oh, I
and
can't
the
wait.
day before.
Yeah, can't wait to try it again. Looking forward to it.
Gotta get
So,
that
yeah,
third memory going.
Yeah.
So this is like the kind of side series we do for Sponge Equilibrium. The idea I had was everyone loves sherry and peat. There seems to be a kind of commercial obvious imperative to do that. We have access to Edradour stocks. They do a peated and an unpeated. They do good sherry casks. So it's really a bit of an experiment and just a bit of fun to come up with a whiskey that expresses the sherry and peat flavor profile, but does it in a different way through kind of targeted cask mixing. So with the first bottling, we did a 10-year-old Edradour from a first fill sherry butt, a 2010, and mixed it with a 2003 refill hogshead of their heavily peated whiskey called Ballechin. Balechin's up to about 50 ppm. It's very heavy peated, and it's very kind of like very mainland peat profile. It's not particularly coastal whiskey. It's very medicinal, very farmy, very powerful. It's kind of like a skinhead Aurora that wants to headbutt you from the top of a tasting glass. It's pretty mental. So with that first whiskey, it was young and old, heavy sherry, refill wood. And with this one, we went something more narrow to change the recipe and give it a slightly more refined take. So this is a 2005 Edradour and a 2005 Ballechin, but both from second fill sherry hogsheads. So refill sherry, peat and unpeated, and so the net overall result is something that's pretty sherried and reasonably well peated, but with an equal amount of age. So everything's a bit more balanced, a bit more refined. The first one, I would say, it's much more to do with like really dark sort of roasted coffee, chocolate, game meats, and really earthy smoke and tar, heavy stuff. This one is probably more about kind of refined, kind of salty sherry, walnut, alongside this really nice like leather and cigar tobacco and all this like really nice kind of more refined, elegant, rustic profile with a nice kind of dry, earthy, herbal peat in the background. I like the whiskey a lot. I think I'm pleased with how they've turned out, and I hope we can do a third one. They take a while to sell because they're probably too expensive, really. But that's the pricing we get from Signatory. We can't really do much about that. But you just got to live with these things if you want to do bottling in this day and age. But the whiskies, these are ones that I often come back to and have a dram of, and I'm really happy with this. So yeah, I think there will be a third one at some point. I don't know what the recipe is yet. I need to really drill down into the casks and have a look at it. But yeah.
Will you be looking at other distilleries as well? Because obviously places like Loch Lomond would probably have peated and unpeated sherries.
I'd love to, but getting anything from sherry, full stop, on the brokers, like people don't understand how brutal it is now to try and buy casks from anywhere, unless you're dealing through relationships with specific companies. It's really, really difficult to buy. Like you can't just go to the brokers list we see recently. It's like they're pricing it for private people that are wanting to buy a cask to own themselves and are willing to pay near enough retail price per bottle in cask. Never so that essentially they bottle it and add on the duty themselves, and they have a private stock of whiskey, which completely shuts out people like us that need to have margin. And it then, beyond that, totally, out of a question, shuts out your ability to have partners like you, because it completely shuts out stacked margin. So yeah, the way of getting around that for us is that we're, first of all, we're lucky we can work with Signatory. We have managed to buy some interesting things. We have good contacts with private individuals. We buy at auctions where we can. So we take a very broad, wide view of how to acquire casks, and we just muddle through and do the best we can. But even with all that, auction prices are incredibly eye-watering. There's a lot of things we can't get anymore just because it just reaches a point where it's like, this just doesn't work. We can't make this work unless, we want to put out like a Port Charlotte. They tend to turn up at auction occasionally, but unless we have to do it for £400 a bottle. And that's at a point where I just think, like, I am willing to accept on average slightly higher than other bottler prices, because I view it as the way of doing business in this day and age. And I don't necessarily like it, but I accept it if the products are very good.
And Angus, when you buy these barrels sometimes from the auction houses, do they give you a sample of that said barrel, or are you kind of keeping faith in the pedigree and the etymology of the barrel?
Some auction houses can provide that, but mostly it's done on instinct. You're doing it off your sort of assessment, your educated guess that this whiskey should be pretty damn good. But that's what I mean, if you're getting up to a point where you're going to have to put this whiskey out at something that's 50, 60, £100 over a consensus market value, then you're either banking on being able to outlay the cash so that you can wait long enough for the market to catch up, or you're banking on it being really good quality. And it's just, it's absorbing too much risk to do that often, so it becomes really difficult. The thing that's really made it challenging is this fanaticism around cask investment, which I sort of understand, but the problem is that it's been driven a lot, I think, by very unscrupulous snake oil salesmen and charlatans promising the earth, powering people's money into something where I really am dubious about them being able to sustain this and deliver the kind of returns that they promise people. And the net result is that the people that want to purchase these stocks in order to bottle them and, run a fair business doing that, the margins get squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. Like the prices that you guys are seeing as consumers for bottles are going up, but they're not going up at the same pace as casks. So the net result is that unless you're an independent bottler that was able to invest heavily in cask stock 10 years ago, then it's really challenging time.
That Ardbeg cask that sold for 30 million the other day has done the entire industry disservice. I personally think it's as drinkers, as collectors, as doesn't matter price. It's just going to ruin not only that, but other Islay distilleries. It's going to have a Springbank effect.
It's such a stunt as well. It's just such the whole thing's just so stage managed and confected, and it's essentially someone that's bought a kind of a very high price per bottle official Ardbeg, which they're just going to take in tranches for 4 years, whatever. And Ardbeg doesn't even age very well past 30. I'm sure it's nice enough, but it's just, it's really, it just does. And Ardbeg as well with this stupid NFT, and it's such a frustrating brand. Like, it's so frustrating the stuff they do, because on one hand, I think things like Fermutation, their 10-year-old, these are great products. They make beautiful distillate. But on the other hand, they just do such stupid things every now and then. It's such a world of extremes, Ardbeg. And it is damaging, because it really reinforces this idea, this messaging, that people will see that and think, oh yeah, I'm just going to invest in whiskey. It's like, you're just spoiling it. You're just causing havoc for, and if things like the independent bottling scene and small scale distilleries, or if these things are damaged, then the whole underlying architecture of what makes whiskey interesting and attractive as a product becomes infected and damaged as well, and becomes weakened. If you can't get good products onto the, I think it's not that bad. I think investment is causing havoc and creating big challenges around pricing and availability. But there's other things happening at the same time which are more positive. Like, there's more new distilleries popping up who are interested to work with indie bottlers. And so that's where I think the future for indie bottling lies more, as relationships and partnerships with newer, more independent, more small scale producers that want qualitative and meaningful and interesting, fun partnerships with indie bottlers in order to help get their whiskey out there. And that's what I think our future is going to be, really.
Well, going back to the whiskey, you mentioned, a nice sherry distillate. We obviously work with Distell, so I was thinking maybe a sherry Tobermory with a nice smoky Laphroaig might be a future blend. We can maybe as an Australian exclusive for you. We can work it out.
We've got we're doing 2 sherry butts of Laphroaig soon, which are both 2005s, and they're both very low in the cask, very concentrated, second fill butts, both quite dark. And the plan is these have already been dumped together into one cask, and they're marrying and mixing. I think there's only about 270 bottles, I think, in total. Anyway, that's going to be done at cask strength, which will be about 63%. These are like almost hot climate matured sherry Laphroaigs, so they're super intense. So that's going to come as WhiskySponge edition 70 later in the year. But they're really like mental whiskey. So yeah, I think you'll probably enjoy that. Book
there'll be a bottle coming to us and then straight to me. That's exactly what's going to happen.
I'm going to have to chat to Stephen. Maybe we can snag like half the cask or something.
And you can, maybe we could do something. I don't know. Have a chat to Stephen. We've perfectly no reason why we couldn't do a big chunk, but yeah. Oh, fuck me, it's going to be really good. All right.
I did want to say, like, for me, there are some sherry distilleries that are great on their own. Others to me, the sherry is a bit mono. Like a Glenfarclas, for example. The family casks are great, but the OBs, I'm getting too much just wood and oak. But then marrying it with like a peat gives it a nice sweetness, and I know you're calling it equilibrium. There's a whole balance to it, but just to me means a sherried whiskey that I can go back to time after time, and I'm not getting fatigue very quickly.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm not always the biggest fan of super heavy sherry. Great old style sherry is a thing of otherworldly beauty, but these sherry casks, which tend to be very dark, very, very intense, and often a bit tannic or like really on intense spice, that just some Abunas, Abuna's a bit of a good example in that they're like too jammy, I think, is a way to think about it. Another good example I've often used is like really big Aussie reds, where you get, when they're young, it's like jam and spice and tannin, but give it 20 years and they evolve into something really beautiful. But sherry for me has to have elegance and balance and a bit of complexity, not just be one thing. So I totally agree. Well, does anyone else have any questions at this point?
Well,
because
this equilibrium too, for me, it's more of it's a special occasion whiskey. It's not a whiskey where you're going to sit down with a mate and polish off a bottle. You're going to savor it and have it from time to time. I don't think a lot of your whiskies I've tried tonight are like that, and that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose. Well, that's I'm pleased to hear that. I do think that I try to think about a whiskey in both lights. Like I suppose it goes back to when you're putting together a bottling or selecting a cask, you try them during the day, but I also try the sample or the blend like at night, as I would as a drinker, and just try to really think about the experience of, what is the drinker going to get out of this, or what sort of mood does it lend itself to? And I think that's quite an important mindset to try and think your way into. And I suppose that something like this, it does lend itself more to what you're describing, which is perhaps more of a kind of peaceful, contemplative, dramming moment.
Yeah.
And that also in turn goes back to what I was talking about, pleasure. Sometimes you just want to treat yourself, and I think absolutely that's what good whiskey should be about, and that's what I try to make our whiskeys about, which is, have fun, but also something which is a bit more like, I've worked hard today, I want to put my feet up and really have a pleasurable thing to drink. Yeah, absolutely. Decadence, you might say.
Mm.
I do genuinely believe that. I mean, when we chose decadent, I chose to name decadent drinks because, you know, I do actually think a little bit of decadence, no matter what your situation in life is often what makes life worth living. And I do actually believe that. So yeah, absolutely. So what have we got here? Old Southern Islay, yay.
Well, I haven't shared the results yet, but we will. We'll.
The results are still secret.
There's a few more people to vote. Important question. We got a very limited supply of this shipment of the whiskies we're trying. Drop me an email, Oliver, at thewhiskylist.com.au if there's a particular one that you tried tonight that you want. I do have the exciting news is more whiskey from Sponge is coming. We had a good meeting with both Angus and Steve and the whole team there. So yeah, we're growing the commitment in terms of how much WhiskySponge is coming to Australia over the next few months and the rest of the year. But if there's a particular bottle you wanted from tonight, email me. If you've also noticed, Ross and Dave are on the call tonight. They run the Old Barrel House, and they've one of our exclusive online retailers that also started taking in stock. So they do have some stock available that they've been holding back for this tasting. So I've just shared their link. Yeah, I don't have any cream. Most of it went to bars, and we cracked, for example, the bottle for the tasting tonight, same as the Ben Nevis. We didn't even have any to move. So if you want, very limited supply of these, but jump on their website and
I can get you more cream if you want more cream.
Oh, we can
just drop us a line. If Australia wants more cream, then Australia could have more cream potentially. We've got a bit extra. So yeah, just let us know.
And this happened in the last tasting. The Jura was the favorite with the 53 edition Coilla, 18-year-old, and we ran out of the Jura. We only had one case, and we've in this latest shipment another case has arrived. So I do have some on stock. I don't know if Chris has put it on the website yet, but yeah, that we're just going to try and backfill when and if possible. Some of the bottles like the Springbank sell out very quickly, but we'll do our best. You guys attending the tastings, you're the fans of Sponge. We try and always hold some back for these tastings. So just reach out, and if not, support the Old Barrel House, because they'll be stocking Sponge as well, which is a great more Aussie bars and retailers who are getting it. Who are joining us on this story it's a great thing. And Angus, from myself at least, thank you again for sharing tonight and your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks,
well, no,
Angus.
listen, thank you guys. Oliver and Emma, thank you for organizing these virtual tastings, because we are terrible at organizing tastings, especially virtual ones. I know they're a pain in the ass to pour samples and to screw on capsules and to do all the fiddly work that makes these things happen. So really appreciate you going to the efforts for that. And thanks everyone for coming along. It's nice to think that something like whiskey and the work that I do day to day, it gives people pleasure on the other side of the planet, and connects us all like this. So it's really cool. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks for buying our bottles and supporting us. And look forward to doing more tastings in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously credit to David, who actually does the screw capping. That's not mine and Ollie's job, thank God.
All right, sorry, David. Yeah, the trooper.
Well, the lucky bastard's going to Scotland in a few weeks' time, so he has nothing to complain about.
I don't feel that bad for him.
Laphroaig's the favourite.
Yeah.
That's good to see. I'm glad. Although I'm kind of surprised the Springbank didn't get any votes, but it seems to be between the last three, which is really it's cool. I'm pleased that Equilibrium gets a couple of votes as well. So that's really cool.
It may have been a lot of people's second or third pick. This is just a one choice vote. Yeah. So for me, I think it was the best Springbank I've had this year, and I've had a few, but I like the Nevis and the Islay ahead of it, so it ranks third for me.
Yeah, well, it goes to show that there's it's not always the things that are most obvious, the sort of balloting bottles. There's a lot of very good whiskey and very pleasurable whiskey to be found out there, that it's not always the most obvious stuff. So yeah, that's cool.
I think Springbank, the word itself scares people away. So they say I'm never going to get hold of that whiskey. So let's go for the normal ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no,
Springbank these days is just one of those people give up on very quickly. If I may ask you a quick one, sorry guys, just been holding on to cask strength whiskies. I see you doing some amazing work with blending and bringing down to a certain ABV and all that experiments that you do, and it's all amazing work you do. All of us here in Australia are like, oh, cask strength, this cask strength, the other, and everybody's just forgotten how good, the lower ABV blends, even if it's 2 casks of the same single malt, are still there, and they're still super enjoyable and super, it should be enjoyed more often rather than the cask strength whiskey. For me, is going to be open a bottle, have a little drum, next month again of the same bottle kind of thing, go visit it again in 6 months. But yeah, it's so refreshing to see how many super cool whiskeys you're creating with your vision, and thank you for that. I mean, we're super excited and stocking the whiskies, and thank you to the Whisky List for allowing us the allocation, and looking forward to seeing what's coming in the future.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that people appreciate the ones where we've sort of intervened a little bit and either mixed stuff together or reduced things slightly. I mean, I think it's a common thread that people get into whiskey and they get into cask strength, and getting to grips with slightly lower strength drams is a bit of a rediscovery. Eventually, after some years, people sort of rediscover 43 or 46%, or even anything kind of below 50. There's just a lot of like immediate easiness and simplicity and pleasure in those sort of strengths, and it's like, after years of nerding out really intensely and being kind of quite a hardcore geek, it's nice to just go back to sort of sipping a whiskey more casually sometimes. So I think that's what it's about for me, really. Anyway, I have to boost, but thank you very much again, everyone. It's been a pleasure to catch up and to talk through these drams with you. And yeah, please support the Whisky List and the bars, and drink the drams and buy the bottles. And yeah, there's my sales pitch done.
Thanks, Angus.
We'll chat soon, mate. Have a good day.
Cheers, everyone.
so much.
Thanks, Oliver. Thanks, Emma.
All the best with
Bye,
work.
everyone. Cheers.